Piloting an airplane takes a unique set of skills that one trains years to perfect. Planes, regardless of size, all follow the same principles of flight. Every plane, from the smallest Cessnas to the likes of the Boeing 747, all have the same control surfaces that exploit the same natural physics of flight. The story behind this video is about an accident when a pilot made what would seem like a small mistake at first, but when compounded by additional factors, led to disaster. Getting to the bottom of American Airlines Flight 625 requires looking at not only the plane the pilots were flying, but also its destination airport and its surrounding area. American Airlines probably does not need an introduction. The carrier is one of the largest in the entire world. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, planes started getting bigger and faster, and the industry somewhat beginning to shape itself into the industry we know today. American Airlines was a large operator of the Boeing 727, one of those planes from that time period. The iconic three-engine plane first launched in 1964 with Eastern Airlines. By the late 1960s, the 727 had already cemented itself as an icon in aviation. The plane was extremely popular in North America. Its range made it ideal for all types of flights across the continent, often flying in and out of many of the major hub airports in the US and Canada. Production of these planes lasted up until the mid-1980s, with the majority of the planes constructed being the Dash 200 model featuring a longer fuselage. The accident plane of today's video was actually the first generation of the type, the Dash 100 model. American Airlines Flight 625 was a flight originating in Providence, Rhode Island, heading to New York, before flying onward to St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands. The first leg of the trip to New York went off without issue. Flight 625 left New York at midday on April 27, 1976, heading south towards the Caribbean. At the flight controls that day was 54-year-old Captain Arthur Bujnowski. He had been flying for American Airlines for many years, having joined the airline in 1941. He, however, left the company in 1944 to join the United States Navy during and after World War II. He returned to the airline in 1949 and had accumulated over 22,000 hours by the time of this accident. By this point, he also had extensive experience in the Boeing 727, having spent 10,000 hours flying the type. It is also worth noting that he was highly experienced on this route, having performed over 150 landings at St. Thomas. It's an interesting bit of experience to bear in mind for when we discuss the airport later. His first officer that day was 36-year-old Edward Ovchis. He had been with the airline for nearly 10 years. Even though he was less experienced than the captain, with 8,000 total flight hours, he had spent 2,500 of those in the 727, making him proficient on this plane. The final member of the flight crew was 45-year-old flight engineer Donald Messler. With 9,500 flight hours to his name, he had been a flight engineer since 1951. The role of the flight engineer is now a relic of the past in aviation. The role involves the monitoring of aircraft systems, something that is now done by the flight computer. Also on board the plane with the 3 pilots were 81 passengers and 4 further flight attendants for a total of 88 people on board the 727. American Airlines Flight 625 cruised over the Atlantic Ocean towards the Caribbean at an altitude of 33,000 feet. The flight would be uneventful until landing. During the descent, flight engineer Donald Messler performed some calculations pertaining to the necessary approach airspeeds and engine parameters for landing. This data was then forwarded to the captain. It was now 3 in the afternoon. The pilots of Flight 625 were in contact with controllers in San Juan. A few minutes later at 3:04, they contacted controllers to cancel their IFR flight plan. IFR stands for Instrument Flight Rules. It allows pilots to fly without visual reference, something that can't really be done at high altitude on an overcast day, for example, and navigate by their instruments. IFR traffic is handled in controlled airspace, and air traffic controllers separate out aircraft accordingly. IFR flight plans are filed ahead of time, so controllers know where each aircraft is going. Pilots, though, can choose to cancel their flight plan and fly under visual flight rules instead, or VFR for short. The meteorological conditions that day were somewhat pleasant. Visibility was over 25 miles, with scattered clouds with a 10-knot wind from the southeast. With the cancellation of their IFR flight plan, the pilots of Flight 625 began flying under visual flight rules. Their destination airport in St. Thomas needs its own discussion. The airport there at the time was rather small and was infamous among pilots as it demanded a lot from them for landing. In 1976, the runway here was just 1,420 meters in length. For reference, the runway has now since been extended to just over 2,100 meters. Given its short length at the time, the Boeing 727-100 was the largest plane that could operate at the airport, and even so, it could only do so in one direction, on an approach to runway 09, now 10. Runway 09 had an instrument landing system equipped, or ILS, that broadcasts a radio signal, and the pilots, with the help of their instruments in the cockpit, can follow that signal to the foot of the runway. It is a standard instrument approach that has been used for decades. When Flight 625 intercepted the ILS signal some several miles out from the airport, the 727 was traveling at a speed of around 160 knots. The pilots had already begun extending the wing flaps for landing, which increased the amount of lift a plane generates at a slower speed, necessary for landing. Between this position and by the time that they were to reach the runway, the speed needs to decrease further. A speed known to pilots as VREF refers to an optimal landing reference speed. Pilots should aim to achieve this airspeed by the time of flying over the threshold of the runway. The flight engineer calculated the speed during the descent phase. The speed can vary depending on the flap position. Giving their weight and wind conditions, with a flap position of 30 degrees, the calculated VREF was 120 knots. That goes down further to 117 knots at a position of 40 degrees. The captain decided to use 30 degrees of flap instead of 40, which was usually done at St. Thomas. According to the accident report, he did this as the plane was more controllable with a 30-degree flap setting. Knowing that winds could gust, he saw it would be easier to manage on landing. The trade-off for that is that the plane's performance was impeded by this decision. This also went against the regular procedures at American Airlines. It would go on record that the pilots didn't feel anything out of the ordinary in this approach, and the plane continued to descend to the runway. The first officer making the necessary altitude callouts, and the captain handling the flight controls. Things would only begin to go wrong as the plane flew over the runway threshold at an altitude of around 50 feet. The flight engineer had made the observation that their airspeed was rather high, about 10 knots higher than their VREF speed. The investigative report comes to the conclusion that the actions made by the captain in the flight's final moments are what led to disaster. So the question now being, what were those actions? In the seconds before a plane touches the runway, a pilot performs a maneuver called a flare. It basically means pitching the nose of the plane into the air so that the undercarriage wheels will touch the runway first. It makes for a more comfortable landing and is done on basically every flight you have ever been on. In this case, when the captain performed the flare, the 727 encountered some small turbulence. This led to the right side wing dropping faster than normal. To counter this, he applied with his control wheel full deflection to the left. As the wings were brought to a level position, the plane's vertical speed had reached a rate of descent of basically zero, leading to what is known to pilots as a float. Floating on landing is exactly what it sounds like. It's where the plane is almost flying level without going down as it should. When this occurred, the first officer pointed it out, stating that they were too high and that he was worried about the remaining runway space. By this point, the 727 had already traveled around 2,000 feet down the runway. The captain then made a firm landing and the 727 touched down. Apparently, as the plane was in the process of touching down, the captain did realize that they could not slow down in time with the runway space remaining. Captain Bujnowski called for a go-around, basically as the plane touched the runway. The throttles were increased, the pilots abandoning this landing attempt. Given the amount of usable runway remaining, and the time needed for the engines to respond and get the plane in a position to take off again, the investigation criticized this action by the captain. There was not enough time or runway for this to be done. The captain still attempted to proceed with the aborted landing at this moment, the first officer asking if the flaps should be retracted, the captain calling first to 15 degrees, which was the incorrect setting in this case, before correcting himself to the stated 25 degrees in the 727 manual. As to how the throttle controls were managed, when the go-around was called, the throttles were set to a position to reach a specific engine pressure ratio, optimal for this kind of scenario. This did not take advantage of the plane's maximum thrust, and so the captain decided to push the throttles all the way up in an attempt to get the plane to generate the energy it needed in time before disaster struck. This was then followed by a complete 180 by the captain. He closed the throttles to idle and tried slamming the brakes. Apparently, he saw the plane was not accelerating as he would have liked, and saw that this was the better option. Subsequently, Flight 625 ran out of room and overran the runway. Runway overruns do happen. Obviously, planes should be landing at airports in conditions so that this shouldn't happen anyway, but when it does, it is most of the time non-fatal and depends on the environment that immediately surrounds the airport. When the 727 broke through the airport boundaries, it struck the ILS equipment beyond the end of the runway. The wingtip on the right side was broken off after striking an embankment. The plane then crossed a roadway, striking multiple cars before crashing into a Shell gas station and exploding. The disaster of American Airlines Flight 625 left 37 of its 88 occupants dead, and a further 38 injured. One occupant of a car at the gas station was severely injured when the crash occurred, but survived. The pilots were among the 51 survivors, and their own accounts of how the crash transpired was critical to investigators in understanding what went wrong. They concluded that the captain's actions were deemed to be the primary causal factor in the crash. The fact that American Airlines even operated this flight led to some criticism towards the airline. The flights to St. Thomas from the US mainland were ceased following this disaster. Instead, the 727s were to fly to the nearby island of St. Croix, and passengers would have to transfer to a smaller plane. The airport at St. Thomas did undergo expansion in the years after Flight 625. The runway is now longer, and larger planes have returned to the island, and American Airlines resumed the New York to St. Thomas route, which it still operates to this day. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you found this video to be interesting, be sure to be subscribed, as there is always a new video every Saturday. Speaking of new videos, there is some exciting new content in the works. I am trying to get a new rail video out sometime soon, and I may also be in a position to bring you a video about a sea disaster, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. These videos I am primarily wanting to keep as additional videos for during the week sometime, just to see how they do. Anyway, it is time to thank the patrons. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, and we have a couple of shoutouts this week. A thank you this week to C. John and Pedro Cruz for their pledges. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to get your name featured here at the end of the next video, consider joining the Disaster Breakdown Patreon to support the channel further, and you'll also get early access to all new videos 2 days before they go out publicly. If you're interested in joining, you can find the link to the Patreon in the pinned comment below. Right now, as I'm recording this, I am currently at work working on the next video, so I shall not keep you here much longer. If you want to follow me on my personal Twitter, you can find that in this video's description if you want. With that said, I will sign off on the video now. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!